Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming. I'll just have to put my glasses on because I printed out some things a little bit smaller than my eyes will allow, so pardon me. Everyone, please welcome our guest, Lucia Osborne-Crowley.
Thank you.
Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting today on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woi Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional owners of the land on which this event is taking place, and acknowledge any First Nations people here with us today. And we pay our respects to their elders, past and present. Thank you so much as well to the Wheeler Centre, who is proud to be working with RMIT Culture to present this event at the Capitol. RMIT Culture unites the university's creative programs and cultural collections, as well as the university's public cultural spaces, including the incredible venue that we're here today, and offers a curated program dedicated to building a community of culture and ideas. I'm a RMIT alumnus myself. I went there for a year to do a graduate diploma in journalism and was very, very grateful for what I learnt there. So thank you, RMIT. And if you could also realise, the bookseller is the Hill of Content for tonight, and this lovely lady will be signing books, and as I often say, it's a legislative requirement that you buy one. So Lucia will be answering questions as well at the end of the night, so don't be shy. She wouldn't be, and neither would I. First of all, I just want to say to you, thank you so much, and I think everyone here will share that thanks, for telling the stories of these women and also for telling your own story. I think, yes.
Thank you.
I am so sick of the fact that we have to keep telling these stories. And it's so important to be honest about it. And I think it's also, I mean, the word brave is overused, but it is brave to talk about your own experience. And I wanted to start with that because, you know, in the sort of old school masculinist journalism that we were brought up with, it wasn't considered cool to not only put yourself in the story, but to put yourself in a way in the story that is actually one of the most profound examples of it that I've seen, but I don't say that as a diss. Why did you choose to do that?
Thank you. And thank you so much for that introduction. And just before I answer that brilliant question, I'd just like to thank you, Louise, for being here with me, long-time hero of mine. And I feel very honoured to be on this stage with you. Thank you to the Wheeler Centre, thank you to RMIT. I'd also like to acknowledge that whenever we write, whenever we engage in activism, whenever we try and change the law, whenever we organise in our communities, we are doing so on stolen land, and that sovereignty was never ceded, and that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And that is very, very important, especially as we've just had the weekend of International Women's Day, and so many events around that to acknowledge the effect of colonial and settler violence both on this land that we now call Australia, and also the settler violence and war crimes being committed in Palestine against Palestinians. So I'd just like to say that. Thank you. And so to go to your question, I mean, I think this is one of the biggest things that I struggled with this book. Because as you say, I was trained as a journalist that the last thing you ever do is put yourself in the story. And that journalism kind of lives or dies or stands or falls on how, quote unquote, objective you can be. and how much you can step out of that story and report it objectively. I've always had a bit of an issue with that, because one of the things that I think, and I realized very strongly in this trial, which is why I ended up writing the book the way I did, is that the idea of objectivity, as it is written into kind of journalism training and also especially into the law, is based on the quote-unquote reasonable man. It's a very male-centered idea, and it's this idea of, that we should be able to divorce ourselves from our emotions or our life experience. And that is a fantasy, in my opinion, and I think the people who profess to do it are the people who are most at risk of that bias coming out without them knowing about it. So I think the best thing to do in this situation, because I am a journalist, is to acknowledge, that I am a survivor of child sexual abuse in a child abuse pyramid scheme that was not unlike Jeffrey Epstein's, not at all similar in terms of global scale and the wealth and power involved, but similar in terms of its structure. And that will always be the case for me. I can't change that. I didn't ask for it, and I didn't deserve it. And that should not then mean that I can't do the work that I want to do just because of something that happened to me when I was a child and is the fault of someone else who decided to visit violence upon me and take away my agency. So what I think is that, the people who make this accusation, and a lot of the journalists at this trial made this accusation against me. So, I had a full 6 weeks of defending myself against this kind of accusation of bias.
Did they do this to your face or behind your back? Oh,
absolutely. Yeah. Very, very much so. Because there were just, a number of instances where there are a lot of men, mostly working for the British tabloids, who would be in the overflow room. So they weren't one of the few of us who got up in the middle of the night to stand in the cold and be in the main room. They were in these overflow rooms. And we would be hearing evidence from victim survivors who were talking about the worst things that had ever happened to them. And we just heard expert evidence about the stages of grooming and about how sophisticated offenders work, how they groom a child, how they isolate a child, how they groom the adults around that child, and how they continue to commit their offences. And so we'd been told, for example, that one of the things that sophisticated perpetrators do is that they identify vulnerable children who have needs that aren't being met at home or in some other context, and they offer to meet those needs. So in Jeffrey and Ghislaine's case, it was often financial, but it can also be emotional, psychological. So they would come along and they'd say, what do you want to be when you grow up? And these are kids who weren't being paid attention to, and then suddenly these people came along and gave them the attention they wanted, and they said, what are your dreams? What do you dream of? What do you hope for? Who do you want to be? And they would promise to try and make that happen. And that's a key part of the grooming process. And then, fast forward 30 years later, we're in a trial in a federal courtroom in Manhattan, and one of these women who did end up being a successful actor, who testified under a pseudonym, so I won't tell you who she is, she used the name Jane. The exact reason that they targeted her, which was that she had this dream of growing up and becoming an actor, and then she made it happen in spite of what they did to her, and then that was used against her in cross-examination. So she told this story of how she was groomed and victimized at a middle school arts camp. So Jeffrey and Ghislaine had a little hut at a middle school arts camp where they would hang out and try and meet young girls, and she was one of them. And she testified about that, and the defense got up and they said, oh, well, you're a successful actor, right? And she said, yes. And they said, right, so you make up stories for a living. And I was just like, oh my goodness. And to me, as someone who's lived through this kind of grooming and this kind of abuse, that's so shocking to me that someone could be able to use something that is actually a key structural part of the offence against you. But then I walked down to the room and there were these people in the overflow room and they just went, she's lying. She made it all up. And they were reporting the headlines every single day. And that is biased to me as well. Because I asked them directly, they had never had experience with sexual offences or sexual violence. They didn't know anyone who had. They've never been touched by these kinds of crimes. And they were writing the headlines that were undermining the credibility of these victims, despite all the science showing that the things that the defence was using to attack them were actually a key part of the grooming process. And so those journalists writing these headlines that were really just uncritically adopting the defence's line of victim blaming, to me, if you're lucky enough, if you're privileged enough to never have been touched in your life by these kinds of crimes, or not know anyone who has, then that's not objectivity either. That is affecting the way they are reporting. And I tried to say this to them, and I don't think I ever won this argument, which is, fine. But I kind of said, I just think the best way to do it is to be upfront about what your biases are. And if that bias is that you really don't know how this works, and you've come to cover this trial with no prior experience or anything of these kinds of crimes, then that's it. Yeah, that's its own form of bias. And I think it's unfair that we see that as objective.
It's really interesting. I remember when I was when I was working on the Pell case, because I didn't actually cover it because I was a witness in it. But, I had spent years working on this and had read thousands of pages of documents and was the only journalist who'd met the victims and all of this sort of stuff. But I'd have these really adorable mansplainy male journalists who would sort of say, what you need to know, Louise, is X, Y, Z. And I'd be like, yeah, thanks. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. And I saw that you called that out in the book, and I thought, thank you, Lucia, for doing that. The other thing that I thought was really interesting when you talk about grooming is, this idea that it's not just children or teenage girls or young women or victim survivors of any description who are groomed, but there's a structural grooming that takes place in society. It's like our whole kind of culture is groomed not to believe people who complain of these crimes. It's astonishing to me how quickly people immediately jump to what are the holes in her argument, or her story, or his story if it's a man. Why do you think that is? And how does it make you feel as a survivor yourself?
This is such a good question. I think about this a lot. Because I've got this so much in my life, both when telling my own story and when reporting the stories of other victim survivors. You get so much unsolicited feedback about quote-unquote inconsistencies in a person's quote-unquote story, which in itself is not the right word.
We'll come to that because I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, and yet that is just so accepted as the way to talk about a person's experience of abuse. We use the word story, and that in itself is linguistically really problematic. And I think there are a number of things going on. I think there, as you say, there's very much a kind of structural level at which we have many systems and structures that support and protect abusers. So this is a kind of an outlier case that really shows how wealth and power protect abusers. The case of Pell is another one. And that these are instructive because they can really show us that the stage of capitalism that we're at means that we have structures where the economy of sexual exploitation is built into our economy and our structures of government, and these people are protected no matter what they do, and it's very, very rare for them to be brought to justice. I mean, Jeffrey is a great example because he was never tried or convicted for any of the things that he actually did. So, I think there are a lot of structures in place that protect these people, and then on an individual level, there's something else going on, which is connected but very slightly different, and that is that, firstly, we are all groomed to participate in this society and an economy where we look up to people with wealth and power, and that makes it easier for them to offend in plain sight. Also, there's something that happens on a very personal and emotional, psychological level, which is that we really don't want to believe these things happen. We really, there is something in our kind of individual and collective psyche that really wants to believe that people don't do this to children. But they do. I can tell you that they do, because I was there, and when it happened to me, but that's really hard for people to accept. There's a level of kind of cognitive dissonance that people engage in, whether knowingly or unknowingly, where they will look for evidence that this story is not true. No matter what version of it they're reading, whether it's my story, whether it's the victim survivors in this book, they will look for evidence that it's not true because they desperately want it not to be true. And that itself, again, is such a privilege. To be able to live in a world where you can believe that these things don't happen. That again means you're in the same position as these journalists whose lives have never been affected by it. They've never known anyone, or they might know people, but those people know it's probably not safe to disclose to them. So they are in this unbelievably privileged position where they get to live in a world where it's possible that we are all lying. And that is so lucky for them. And they really want to hold on to that privilege and the power that comes with that privilege.
And it's interesting because this particular case, unlike some other cases that I've covered, for instance, it was sort of like the cart after the horse in the sense, or maybe is that the wrong way around? Anyway, you know what I mean. The victim survivors had already received compensation, like quite substantial compensation, by the time this came around. So there was nothing more for them to actually materially gain from this. And they're different people at different times who didn't know each other. And yet there's this assumption that all of these people can be suffering from some sort of mass hysteria about some other,
Absolutely. And it was really shocking that I mean, again, I shouldn't say that because I've been reporting on this kind of stuff for a decade, and I shouldn't be shocked by this, but I still am, that was the defense that they went with. That it really was just every single one of these people is lying. And not only that, they really went in for these people are trying to get attention and trying to get a quote-unquote big payday. Now, obviously, there are a number of problems there. The first is that anyone who's ever disclosed childhood sexual abuse or any kind of sexual violence knows that it is a horrific process, even if that's disclosure to your friends and family or disclosure to law enforcement. It's awful, it's re-traumatizing. Nobody is doing it for attention.
And most people never do it.
Most people never do it because they see what happens to the people who do. So the idea that we're doing it for attention, outrageous. The idea that these women were doing it for money is just like fundamentally untrue. And again, I have a lot of law reform ideas about this, and one of them is that, you really shouldn't be able to make arguments that are so fundamental to your case that are just not true. So there's no way in a criminal trial that a witness can be paid by the government to testify. That cannot happen in this country, it can't happen in the US, and it can't happen where I work as a court reporter in the UK. So this idea, as you say, they had already approached the Epstein victims' compensation scheme. They'd been put through the ringer for years, and I was with them when they were doing this, and it was awful. It was re-traumatizing and grueling, and they proved to that compensation scheme, Jeffrey is famous for saying, make sure none of these women get any of my money. So the fact that, that was one of the highest bars to reach to prove to that scheme that this had happened, and they did that and they proved it and they were compensated for that. There is nothing about this federal trial that would have changed that compensation or would have added to that compensation anyway. That's just a fact. And yet, we heard it for 6 weeks that these women were just here. Basically, what the defense said was, they're adding Ghislaine Maxwell to the story now. So part of their argument was, Jeffrey did this, what a bad man. Here's our poor innocent client who knew nothing about it. And she just was the victim of a bad relationship, was essentially their argument, which is absurd. And so they kind of said, these women are just adding Ghislaine into the story 30 years later to get some more money. And there's just no factual basis for that, and I don't think arguments like that should be allowed in a court of law, where, when you're trained as a lawyer, you get taught about the pillars of this profession, about, being about truth and honesty and all of that, and it feels very jarring.
Yeah, that's one thing I wanted to raise with you, because I know in my own experience, we're both law graduates, and, you leave law school feeling very sort of bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and, having very sort of positive/naive ideas about the law. And then as a journalist, your main experience with lawyers for a long time is in pre-publication advice. And, the lawyers will hone in on things, how do you know this, how do you know that, how do you know that? But it's interesting when you find yourself either following a case like this in such, sort of forensic detail, where you get up at 2 o'clock in the morning every morning to go and watch it, or you actually are, as I have been, in a situation where you're on the other side of the ledger and, you find yourself being a witness, that actually lawyers, a lot of the time, a lot of the documents that I've read from them, I'm like, my God, there's no way this would pass a Four Corners fact check. They're pretty slippery with the truth. It's all about an argument. It's not about the truth. And as an investigative journalist, it's a really dispiriting thing to sort of come to see. I mean, is that something you found?
Absolutely, and I think that interaction between law and investigative journalism, particularly at the moment, again, in the major jurisdictions that I work in, being kind of some of the jurisdictions in Australia, England and Wales, and then Scotland, and the federal jurisdiction in the US, we are living in an incredibly hostile time in terms of the law and public interest journalism. So I was told that, so there are about 5 names of very public figures that victim survivors told me had either enabled or participated in this sex trafficking ring, and I wanted to report that in this book. And I was told that I could not do that unless I could prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. So that is very, very alarming, because obviously the assumption there is that those men will sue me for defamation.
Wouldn't it be on the balance of probabilities?
Exactly, it should be. On the letter of the law, it should be. So defamation is a civil action. It should be found on the balance of probabilities. That is so fundamental, that defamation is a civil action. But we have come so far in this kind of backlash against people speaking out and journalists reporting on people speaking out, that I was actually told, and I looked up the case law myself because I was so angry, and this lawyer was right about the case law. It has got, and this is specifically in England and Wales, so it had gone so far that judges in defamation cases were saying a journalist should not publish anything unless they can prove it to beyond reasonable doubt standard. So that is completely subverting the legal system. It's taking a criminal standard and putting it into a civil action, and that protects perpetrators, and it protects wealthy perpetrators in particular, because it costs about 10 grand in England and Wales to file a defamation suit. For the people that I'm talking about, that I wanted to name, that is pocket change. They could do that against me in every jurisdiction this book has sold, and they wouldn't even notice that money, leaving their account. They could hit me with defamation suits, even though I could prove what I had reported. But the problem is that you then have to defend that action in every single jurisdiction, and publishers and newspapers can't afford to do that. And they're seeing judges say, journalists shouldn't engage in journalism unless they can prove beyond a reasonable doubt. So what that does is it confuses the journalist with the public prosecutor. So those are 2 very separate jobs. A journalist should not have to do the role of getting to beyond a reasonable doubt.
Well, a journalist isn't putting someone in jail.
Exactly. And again, you know this from law school and all these things that I believed in, which is that the standard beyond reasonable doubt is so high because the stakes are so high. Because you are, and I really, I'm an abolitionist when it comes to prison and prison reform. I really believe that standard should be high when we are thinking about putting someone into a system that itself is so traumatic and so broken. But, once you separate the stakes, once you take the beyond reasonable doubt standard and you apply it to something where the stakes are so much lower, where these people, for example, that I wanted to name, they were never going to go to jail because I named them in this book. They will never go to jail for as long as they live, probably, which is awful. But, specifically here, there is no threat to their liberty. There is a threat to their reputation. And we are living in a world where their reputation is being protected institutionally. It's written in case law, even though the letter of legislation says this is a civil action, it's balance of probabilities. But we have become so obsessed with protecting the reputations of men, largely men, women as well, obviously, because this is a book about Ghislaine Maxwell, who are accused of these kinds of offences, that their right to maintain a reputation is being prioritised by the courts over a victim's right to speak or a victim's right to speak to a journalist. And that's really, really problematic, because investigative journalism and the criminal law should be very, very separate. And they have distinct functions, as you and I both know, because we've been involved in both of them in various ways. And that is breaking down, and that's a real problem, because it's silencing victims and journalists who want to speak on behalf of victims more than ever.
Now, the function of this book really seemed to me to be about elevating the voices of survivors, not just the survivors whose stories you tell, but all survivors. But I felt like Ghislaine was sort of, this kind of ephemeral presence. And I'm guessing that was a deliberate thing, but I'm interested, given that you did sit in on that case every day, what did you make of her? What do you think was motivating her? Did you get a sense of that, or was she so kind of protected by this system that you didn't really get to penetrate that?
I think the answer to the second question is definitely yes, which is a really interesting part of this trial, because she was so protected by the institutions who were claiming to finally be prosecuting her. One of the really important things to remember is that she and Jeffrey were first reported to the FBI in 1995, and I sat in this courtroom in 2021. And there are so many lives that could have been spared in those decades if law enforcement had done their jobs and believed those children when they came to the FBI in West Palm Beach in 1995. And so, she has been protected her whole life, and that includes this trial. She was treated like royalty. Her family were treated like royalty. They were given seats over victims, even though in the US there's a piece of legislation called the Crimes Victims' Rights Act, which gives a crime victim a right to a comfortable and accessible seat in the trial of their offender or alleged offender. A number of the victim survivors of Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell have long-term disabilities. I have a long-term disability, which doctors believe is connected to my history, and they were not given, let alone an accessible seat, they were not given a seat in the courtroom, despite the fact that legislation says they have to. She and her family were escorted into that courtroom like royalty every single day. And that's how they've been treated their whole lives, that family. And it was so shocking to see victims crying outside because they couldn't be in the courtroom to watch her finally face justice. They're in their 50s now. This happened to them when they were kids. And they were still not allowed in the room. So there was a huge protection of her. The other element is that in answering this question, I always try to avoid kind of making any statements about her in terms of why she did it, just because, as you say, I made a choice not to really investigate that in this book, just because I really wanted to focus on the survivors, both who they were as children, who they have been in the last 30 years, and who they are now. And in one book, you can't do both of those things. So, I haven't done the original reporting in order to tell you anything about her, and I kind of did that intentionally because I think she's been given a lot of oxygen, and so is he. And also there's a part of me, and this maybe comes back to our question about bias, there's a part of me that thinks, I don't know why people do this to children, and I don't think, I could report on it for 10 years, and I don't think I would understand that enough to communicate.
Oh, she doesn't have an excuse.
Yeah, to communicate it to an audience, so there are those things. But what I can do is tell you about what it was like sitting a foot away from her for 6 weeks. And so this is not, this is not based on my reporting of her or any original reporting. This is literally just observational. And I tried to go into it being very open-minded about her role. There's lots of suggestions that she was going to argue that she herself was a victim of Jeffrey Epstein because she was also abused by her father, Robert Maxwell, and that there was a kind of cycle of trauma going on. She ended up not making that argument until she was convicted, and then she did make that argument, which is a whole other thing. So anyway, I went into it very open-minded, but it was alarming being near her. The vibe that she gave off was very much that she thought we were all wasting her time. She really didn't want to be there. She would come in laughing and joking with the federal marshals that brought her from her cell, and she would give them kisses and hug her lawyers, and she just looked really bored all the time. We were hearing a heartbreaking testimony. I was weeping, and she looked bored. She really looked like she didn't think she needed to be there. And on Christmas Day of 2021 was her 60th birthday. It was one of the only days we got off from trial. We got Christmas Day off, and then the next day we came in, and she walked in, and everyone, so it was just the 4 reporters, her family, her lawyers, her court marshals, and she walks in, and everyone together says, "Happy birthday, G, happy birthday, G," and they're kissing her on the lips and hugging her, and and she looked to the 4 of us, because there were only 4 of us allowed in the actual room. She looked at us as if we were going to wish her a happy birthday. Genuinely, it was like she thought I was at her cocktail party and not at her federal sex trafficking trial. That this is the person she is. And that became more and more obvious every single day. I mean, another story that's in the book is that I was sitting right next to a woman called Jane who does the sketch. She's the sketch artist for Reuters. So in US federal courts, you can't have any camera or filming devices. So that's why you see the sketches of Harvey Weinstein. Anything federal, you'll only see sketches of. So Jane is the only person who's allowed to stand up in the press gallery. She's sketching. And Ghislaine really didn't like that. So these witnesses were giving evidence, again, about awful things that she was found to have done. So she was later convicted of these things. We have proof beyond a reasonable doubt that she did them. While she was hearing about them, she turned around and started drawing her in this very weird power move. And then she would show Jane on a legal pad just with a biro. And Jane was doing this beautiful artwork. And then I said to my colleague who was sitting next to me, I said, "I think Ghislaine is drawing Jane." And she saw me say that. And then she started drawing me, telling him that she was drawing Jane, drawing her. And then she showed me this drawing of myself that she had done.
It's quite sociopathic.
It was very, and the way she locked eyes with me when she was showing it to me was genuinely really frightening. So those kind of observations, again, I did go in there with an open mind, but those kind of observations were very chilling. And yet at the same time, there was security and some people milling around. So it's often some of the reporters in the overflow room were allowed in the main courtroom during breaks, so when nothing was happening. And this happened quite a few times, even when people knew my history, because I'd been debating the other reporters thinking that these women were lying, and I disclosed my history to them. So even when they knew that this had happened to me as a child, they would see these things from the overflow room. So they saw her drawing me on a screen and they came in. This happened multiple times. And they were like, don't worry, Lucia, you're too old for her. And they all just laughed about it together.
I remember that happening when, not that, but I covered courts for a few years, and I remember there would always be a party at the end where the cops would go out drinking with the Crown and the journos.
Yep.
And I remember the family would come as well. I mean, when you think back on it, I mean, it's just completely nuts. Like, why did this happen? But it did. And I think it was just a way of everyone sort of letting off steam. But people were so desensitised to this process that they didn't realise how it looked. And I remember one time this family member of the murdered person sitting in the corner of the room, and all the sort of police and lawyers and journos are all like laughing and throwing back drinks and all this sort of stuff. And this woman was just looking at them, and I had to go over to her and say, I'm so sorry. They just don't know.
Yep.
They've just separated themselves from this. But the point that I think you make so strongly in this book is that we shouldn't be separating ourselves from this, because this is terrible human tragedy, and what has happened to so many children and women at the hands of mostly men, but in this case a woman too, is not acceptable.
I'm sorry.
But on that point, I wanted to ask you about your relationship with the victim survivors themselves. And I mean, I've never seen, I don't think, any journalism before where a journalist talks about the fact that someone was their friend. So you say that about one of the women, and about another of the women, Carolyn, you say that you loved her and that she loved you, which I thought was extraordinarily honest. And I thought you might want to sort of read from the book about Carolyn and tell us about her.
Yeah, thank you. So Carolyn testified at the trial under her first name only. Her testimony was incredibly heartbreaking, and I spoke to a number of jurors, both on and off the record, after the trial, who said that her testimony was, really key in this conviction. She has had such a difficult life since she escaped Jeffrey and Ghislaine. It was so hard for her to escape from them. And I met her and I became very close to her. And, I think it's hard to tell this story in long form without admitting that she used to say, I love you every day on the phone, and I would say it back. I think it's important to be honest with readers about that. That's the relationship that we had. And if that makes me biased, then that's what it makes me, and that's fine. She died very suddenly in the course of this reporting, which was just incredibly difficult to deal with, and just so sad, because she was so resilient and she fought tooth and nail.
And she was only 36.
She was only 36. And she fought so hard. She fought for her life against these people. It's such a huge loss to all of us that she's not here anymore, because she was preparing to reveal a lot more. So because that happened in the middle of writing this book, I have since then been in close touch with her family and her young children, who now have to live without her. And so the book it starts with her and it ends with her, and it's dedicated to her. So I sometimes just like to read just a very, very short bit from the beginning of the book, starting with the epigraph, which is a poem dedicated to her, and then the opening chapter just starts with me meeting her, which I didn't expect I would ever get to do, and then meeting her kind of changed my life and taught me a lot about my own survival and my own recovery. So the epigraph of the poem is called My Dead Friends. I have begun when I'm weary and can't decide an answer to a bewildering question, to ask my dead friends for their opinion. And the answer is often immediate and clear. Should I take the job, move to the city? Should I try and conceive a child in my middle age? They stand in unison, shaking their heads and smiling. Whatever leads to joy, they always answer, to more life and less worry. I look into the vase where Billy's ashes were. It's green in there, a green vase. And I ask Billy if I should return the difficult phone call, and he says, yes. Billy's already gone through the frightening door. Whatever he says, I'll do. West Palm Beach, 9th of September, 2022. The Floridian heat overwhelms me as I step out of Miami International Airport and begin to make my way to the airport hotel. The air is heavy and full of moisture. The hot wind carries an ominous feeling and a sense of dread. My flight out of Heathrow was delayed by several hours due to the Queen's death, and so I've missed my train to West Palm Beach, and instead I'm staying in a hotel for the night and finishing my journey in the morning. Already this trip feels doomed. I'm here because a few weeks ago I sent an email to a lawyer named Jack Scarola about his client, who is known only by her first name, Carolyn. Carolyn, who, as I am writing this, is now and always will be 36 years old, was sexually abused by Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell beginning when she was 14 years old. Carolyn testified at Maxwell's trial using only her first name to protect herself and her young family from the disastrous consequences that too often come with speaking out. Carolyn has never spoken at length to a journalist before. When I emailed Scarola asking him to interview Carolyn, I did not expect that she would say yes. But nonetheless, I sat down and I wrote, as I always do, a long email about the ways I try and ensure my journalism is trauma-informed and safe and sensitive and puts victims' needs and comfort first. I also, as I always do, disclose that I myself am a survivor of child sexual abuse and have dedicated my investigative reporting skills to trying to contribute to a better understanding of the scourge of sexual abuse and its long, long shadow. To my great surprise, Carolyn responded to Scarola almost immediately. Please tell this journalist I would love to speak to her for her book and to call me ASAP. Before long, Carolyn and I had spoken on the phone and arranged for me to fly to West Palm Beach to see her. That night, I reflect on how surreal it feels to be meeting Carolyn after thinking about her so regularly for almost a year, ever since hearing her testimony on the stand at Ghislaine Maxwell's federal sex trafficking trial in December of 2021. Her story affected me so deeply, and I feel honoured that she is willing to share more of her story with me. Carolyn's story was crucial to bringing Ghislaine Maxwell to justice, because it laid bare in an excruciatingly honest way just how severe the lifelong effects of trauma really are, because Carolyn hid nothing from that jury about her life. Her testimony was raw, honest, unfiltered, and completely heartbreaking. Carolyn's story perfectly captures the way that trauma in childhood alters the course of our lives, the way it leaves us vulnerable to addiction, self-loathing, and to more trauma, the way it traps us in a cycle of violence and shame, the way it refuses to let us go. So here I am, almost a year after verdict day, sitting on a Greyhound bus from Miami to West Palm Beach to meet Carolyn in the flesh, to meet the person who contributed to changing the course of history.
And I think the point that needs to be made about Carolyn, dying at the age of 36, a lot of the victims, I won't call them survivors in this context because they weren't survivors. They didn't survive, that I have come into contact with, died before their time as well, died decades before their abuser eventually shifted off his mortal coil. And, the Royal Commission here into child abuse found that these people were much more likely to have chronic illnesses, to take their own lives, to die of, things that they shouldn't have died from earlier. So it's something that's really important to emphasise. Now, I'm just noting the time, and we've got some questions here, and this was something that I was going to ask you myself as well. Do you believe that there's any chance for genuine law reform in these sorts of cases? You come up with some things that you think should change, and what are they?
Yeah, this is a great question. I do. I mean, I'm somewhat surprisingly deeply constitutionally optimistic person. Very, very hopeful, sometimes in a misplaced way. But I do feel very hopeful that we will change the law on these kinds of things. I think the conversation, at least the conversation that we're having, is getting more nuanced. There's a legal backlash that I referenced before about in terms of the defamation law, and that's a really, really big problem. But in terms of the criminal law, I think there are a lot of changes that we can think very seriously about making. I mean, we had the inquiry and the report last week, and I think lawmakers are starting to think more seriously about these things. One of the things that I would say, for example, that is really easy, I'm not a lawmaker, so I shouldn't say that, but it feels like it should be quite easy, is to have really strict rules in cross-examination in crimes involving sexual violence and any crimes involving traumatic memory. Because we have decades and decades of neurobiological and neurochemical research about traumatic memory. That science is not challenged, it's very much settled. That is about how difficult it is to retrieve traumatic memories, how difficult, impossible it is when those traumatic memories are unprocessed. They stay in what's called the amygdala, which is the part of the brain that deals with survival. So survival emotions like fear and danger. Emotions stay in that part, whereas long-term memories will go to the brainstem. And that's when you can recall a memory without recalling the feeling that is associated with it. So you can say, 5 years ago this happened. That's when a memory is in, and you can tell it from start to finish. It's a narrative. The brainstem does that. Traumatic memories never get to the brainstem unless you get a lot of professional help. And that means that you cannot narrativize them. So what we expect in cross-examination of trauma victims is a narrative. Literally, by definition, that is something they cannot provide. So to try and expect that you are setting people up to fail, and you are setting people up to be asked to do something that they cannot do, and then use against them the fact that they can't do it. That is something we could very easily change. We could say that cross-examination questions in crimes involving trauma must be based on scientific evidence. We cannot be saying, because you don't know how many stairs there were in Jeffrey Epstein's office, that means you're making it up. Because if you've just been sexually assaulted, it is incredibly scientifically unlikely that you'll have any earthly idea how many stairs there are in that room.
But, even if you hadn't been, who is
exactly.
to remember that? And you see it time and time again, and it becomes a form of bullying of witnesses.
Absolutely.
I just don't understand how they continue to get away with asking and treating people in a way that they are not treated in any other forum.
In any other context.
And this is someone who's reliving, the worst thing that's ever happened to them. Mm-hmm. This is from Ella and Caitlin, who are PhD students in criminology.
Congratulations.
What is the key to trauma-informed interviewing?
Oh, well, that's such a good question. Thank you so much. There's a number of them, and I've done as much training as I can in this. But I want to qualify this by saying that I'm not a psychologist, but I have done as much journalistic training as I can. And I think the most important thing is to set up a level of what we call containment for the interview subject. That means being able to let that person have complete agency in how the interview takes place, how the conversation takes place, before any disclosure, before moving into recalling or retrieving any kind of traumatic memory. Basically, what we know in trauma theory is that when we're re-traumatized, again, we go into the amygdala, and we're in a survival state. By definition, when we're in a survival state, the frontal lobe, or what we call the executive function, is offline. So what's really important to remember about traumatized interview subjects is that it's really important to set up those parameters when they feel comfortable, before you've asked them to disclose anything at all, when they're not in survival mode. So when their executive function is online, and you say, what are the rules? How do we want this to look? And then honour that, be really, really, really strict with yourself in honouring that, but also learn about the signs as much as you can. I do this a lot from going to therapy myself or interviewing therapists about the signs of what we call dysregulation. So when someone goes into a survival mode, they'll become emotionally dysregulated. You'll get physical signs of that, often, particularly in survivors of this kind of abuse who will have been forced or pressured to perform for a lot of their lives. Often you won't necessarily see it in their words because they're very good at kind of performing functionality. Often that's a survival tactic for children in these situations. So it's about looking out for the physical signs, things like shortness of breath, sweating, these kinds of things that are really easy to spot, and then you can say to someone, look, now might be a good time to take a break, while also acknowledging that the most important thing with a trauma survivor is that what happened to them took away their sense of agency in this world. So in an interview, the most important thing is to make sure they have that agency. So if you spot some of these signs and you say, we should take a break, and they say no, it's really important to respect that. And then, if you are spotting these things, be really open in your communication. This is another thing that trauma survivors don't get as children. You say, this is what I'm noticing about you. I'm concerned, and as someone with the duty of care of you in this situation, I'm concerned about this and that. And, those are the things that I follow really, really strictly. I think agency is the really crucial thing to always remember, and to just be as informed as you can about those signs of dysregulation, and treat trauma survivors with the utmost respect in terms of that agency over their own lives, because that's the thing that was taken away from them.
I think another really easy practical thing to do as a journalist is use the documents.
Yes.
So use the police statements,
yes, and
the statements of claim if they're suing or whatever, to get their story before you, and to say to them, you don't
have
need
to
keep
yep.
telling me your story. We can talk about around it, and maybe we might talk about it once.
Yes.
But that will be the only time.
Yeah, and we will set up when that will be, and you can prepare for it, and you can arrange support before and after, and all of that. I think that's exactly right, and I do this a lot with these victim survivors, is that I use the document, because, as you said, for the majority of them, the ones who testified, there are people in this book who didn't testify at trial, but they all had many, many legal documents detailing what had happened to them. We did not need to go over that. Some of them wanted to, but in the cases where they didn't, we absolutely didn't have to, because I had documentary evidence of that. And that allowed them to speak to me about things like how it felt like when their teenage relationship broke down because they were being trafficked and they couldn't tell anybody about it. And that's the stuff that doesn't get told when you're just doing an interview about the trauma.
So there's a question which I find really interesting. It's about restorative justice. Mm-hmm. When I was researching my book, Witness, about this process, talking to survivors and advocates, they were like, the only people who actually are interested in restorative justice are academics who like restorative justice. So for people who don't understand, restorative justice is where you get the victim survivor and the perpetrator in the same room. And what was said to me was, what a horrible idea. Mm-hmm. Why do they want to talk to this person? Mm-hmm. Maybe there are a tiny number of cases in which it would work, but I'm interested, because you are a survivor, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a great question, and I can say personally, there is no situation where I would want to be in a room with that person.
Yeah.
And in a situation where I'm expecting something from him that I know based on his personality and his repeat offending that I will never ever get. Restorative, that model will not work with perpetrators who have no remorse. But the other thing is that one of the best things I learned about trauma is that trauma is not what happens to you, it's what happens inside of you. So trauma is not defined by the traumatic event itself. It's not like some things are a 10 on the trauma scale and some things are a 1. It's about your nervous system's response to that. And that is determined by your personal history, by a number of other things. So for every traumatized person, there are as many responses to trauma as there are traumatized people, because it's about what has happened inside of them when violence or violation or whatever it is was visited upon them. So I don't think there's any blanket model that will work for trauma. I think the best way to be trauma-informed is to understand that we are all different, and that it is about, I think, giving care to that victim-survivor through really, really good professional psychological care to work out what the best version of justice is for them. And I understand that's hard at a policy level, but that is the reason why this kind of version of restorative justice does feel quite jarring for some of us.
There's another one that I was just going to quickly sneak in, but it's disappeared. It was about Trump. Oh, yeah. What's your view on accountability in a Trump 2.0 world with rising toxic masculinity and abusers in powerful roles?
Such a great question. I'm glad you found that one again.
It's
a really good question.
It just disappeared on the thing, I think, yeah.
I mean, look, I feel really, really strongly about this. It's publicly known that Donald Trump was very good friends with both Jeffrey and Ghislaine. There's reporting to suggest it went further than that. Not only is he at least friends with people who operated the biggest global child sex trafficking ring in what we believe in modern history, he also has been found liable by a court of law to be a sexual abuser.
He also thinks that if you grab women by the pussies, they love it.
Yeah, and this man is confirmed by a jury to be a rapist, and he is in the White House. I mean, structurally, it is. You cannot overstate how concerning and dangerous that is. Just taking this one example, Elon Musk is also known to be an associate of both Jeffrey and Ghislaine. He has managed to become so close to the seat of executive power, despite having never been a politician, having never been involved in government, and he has allegations against him separate from this as well.
Does he deny those allegations just because we're in a public forum here?
Yes, he does deny those allegations. There are, I think there's a version of this story where a lot of people would like to say, oh, well, Ghislaine was convicted, Jeffrey's dead, so that's the end of that. That could not be further from the truth. If we look at the fact that one of their associates is in the White House and was separately found liable by a jury of his peers for committing sexual abuse, and that a number, in the UK we have Peter Mandelson, who we know was on the island when there were girls being trafficked, also on the island. He has come out of political retirement, essentially, to be the ambassador to the US. He is a known associate of theirs. So the idea that, allegations of being close to this kind of offending can ruin a career have never been less true.
Yeah, that's true. It really does seem like they don't seem to penetrate in the way that they once did. And yeah, that's a sobering thought to end on.
Sorry, I just said that I was a
Unfortunately, we
hopeful
could sit
person.
here and talk under wet cement for hours. But thank you, everyone, so much for coming, and please thank your lovely guest.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you
And
so
remember,
much, Louise.
Lucia will be signing, so get out there and buy the book. Buy.
And thank you, Louise, and thank you, everyone, for coming. I really appreciate it.